Okay. Looks like we are live on.
Mine says live.
Excellent. Well, this is the first ever Real Crusades History Live Google Hangout. Welcome to everybody out there who is tuned in at the moment. My name is J. Stephen Roberts. I am the founder of Real Crusades History. And I'd just like to say welcome to everybody who is going to be viewing this or listening to this this evening. We're very glad to have you. Joining me this evening is going to be the staff at Real Crusades History. We've got Scott Amos. Scott, how you doing?
I'm great, Stephen. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Good to have you here, Scott. And we've also got Peter Safarian. Peter, how are you?
Doing great, Stephen. Glad to be here as well.
Good. And we're just waiting on Rand.
Been graced
He's
by
here.
Rand's presence.
Can you hear me?
All right, Rand Brown. Rand, we're live on air, Rand.
He's back on the battlefield.
Yeah, hey, I had to go make a birthday beverage real quick.
Aha.
Happy birthday, Rand.
Yeah, happy birthday, Rand. I just I noticed that a few minutes ago.
Thank you. Thank you much.
So,
beverage.
okay, looks like I'm looking at the view count now. We got 43 people watching right now. Does anybody have any questions? Just type them in the chat.
Sweet.
So we can start talking to you folks out there. Let's see.
Do we have the Twitter questions up?
Yeah, and also if you want to hashtag us at hashtag AskRCH, I'll type that in the chat here.
Do we have this like advertised on the page at all, or?
Yeah, it was advertised.
It's been on
We got 40
both pages as well, and I
viewers
put it
now.
on mine, and so it's
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a few messages from some people that in the past few days, and I was directing them to here. They had some interesting questions. I said, you know what, those would be great questions to ask while we're live. So
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet, though.
I'm not either.
yeah, I'm not picking anything up.
Did people send us in questions?
Let me look.
I got one yesterday from a guy who he was wanting to know. He emailed it to me, and he was wanting to ask if we had done a book review on Hillaire Belloc's book on the Crusades. And
Oh yeah.
I had read that years ago. I mean, I think I was in college at the time.
Yeah, it's a classic.
So that was over 10 years ago. But unfortunately I couldn't remember a whole lot from it. But and I thought we had done a review of Belloc's book, but it could have been a while ago. I wasn't sure.
Yeah. Well, that book, I think it's a really good book. It's definitely a classic. There are some aspects of it, though, that are probably kind of dated just because of how old it is. I mean, our scholarship has really evolved since that point.
It's kind of like somebody from a military history perspective, sort of asking, oh, hey, how's Sir Charles Oman, as a military historian. It's like, well, back in 1890 something, he was great, but the historical discipline is advanced far beyond the things that he said. So
yeah, it's like I remember he makes a big deal out of the first three kings of Jerusalem, Baldwin the First, Baldwin the Second, Baldwin the Third, which I think that makes sense. But at the same time, I don't think that.
Guys, real quick, I'm getting if I just went to the chat on the video itself on YouTube, and we are getting a lot of comments actually.
Oh,
Oh, nice.
okay. On YouTube, Peter. All right.
Yeah, like I clicked on the video from the perspective of a viewer, not from where we are in the Hangout. So
All right.
That's
Let me
right.
see. All right. Now I'm on YouTube. How would I get the Hangout?
like I clicked on the video from the perspective of a viewer.
Okay, I found it too. Yeah, here's the
where
chat.
We are in the
Okay.
Hangout. So
All right. Let me see. All right. Yeah, how would I get
What's
okay,
up,
here
guys?
it is.
Hold up.
from the perspective of a viewer.
I'm here.
I found it too. Yeah, here's the chat.
Now we're getting all these echoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, make sure the sound is muted on the video.
This is
On YouTube.
crazy. All the comments.
Yeah. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, everybody, sorry that this is a little bit crazy right now. We are getting familiar with this format. But okay, so we've got some questions here. Let's see if we can answer some of them. Does God will it? I would say God does will it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are the Catholics?
Now, should we be both here on?
What's that, Scott? What's Scott saying? I think Scott's gone. Okay, Rand and Peter, are you guys still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, hopefully Scott will find his way back on here. All right, let's see here. How did you guys not look? This is how we do it, folks. This is
Blame Steven. He got here late.
true. Yeah, but here's the thing about this, guys. This is a live event. This is raw, and this is how we connect with the Real Crusades history community out there. All right, so here's an interesting one. What was the difference between medieval Islamic treatment of women and medieval Christian treatment of women? Now, that's a very interesting question.
Very good one.
I think that I can answer that. I would say that if we're talking about the Islamic world, women were much more they were sequestered. I guess we'd say they did not have the type of public life that medieval women in the Latin West had. Would you guys agree with that? Like, for example, we don't know the name.
Yeah.
Like Dr. Helena Schroeder always makes this point. We don't know the names of, for example, any of Saladin's wives, for example. We don't know the names of any of the mothers of his various sons. Whereas in the Latin West, we do. There's all kinds of female personalities that we know about. They were more involved in a more public type of life. Now, that doesn't mean that there was definitely a hierarchy of the sexes in the Latin West as well. Like, for example, in a marriage, the man was the senior partner, but at the same time, there was just like, I guess you would say that there was more of a public life for women in the West.
Very much so.
So
I think there's always a few, like there's some very, very, very few exceptions. Especially from Moorish Spain, you get a few, females who, they actually did kind of make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
But it was always that was always very much the exception in the Islamic world. Whereas in the Christian West, you see, it's just the number of women who, made a decent impact on development of European history and European society. You almost can't list them all. There's tons of them.
Yeah.
And even the ones that didn't, they were still, queens were always known by name, and even prominent noble women, were always known by name, and stuff like that. So and always featured very heavily in the chronicles and things like that. So by no means, there was no Islamic equivalent of an Eleanor of Aquitaine, or a Matilda of Tuscany, or Joanna de Montfort, or there was it just didn't exist. They weren't there.
Some
Um,
guy goes, female leadership is degenerate. Okay. So somebody just asked, why was there no effort made to retake Constantinople?
I just saw that one, and I had that one flagged. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Anybody have any thoughts on
That's
that?
a really good question. Well, actually, it's actually a little. It's not entirely accurate. There actually were a few, unfortunately, very abortive efforts to try and retake Constantinople after it fell, mostly from the Central European powers, the Hungarians. I believe there was an effort, Italian city-states, to try and retake it, but unfortunately, they all either through lack of interest, lack of funding, insufficient materials. It just never really came about. 1453 was the 1450s was a very, very interesting time for Europe, and very tumultuous. You had a lot of really crazy stuff going on right about that time.
Somebody in the chat said the Ottomans were too strong. I think that's a good point too, actually. At that point, the Ottoman Empire was very much in the ascent. And Europe was, unless, you'd had all these various European powers uniting, you would not have seen, the ability to really challenge like the Ottoman control of the Bosporus at that point, I think.
Yeah.
Like maybe
very, very much so. And the Italian city-states were that, especially the Venetians and the Genoans that had colonies out there in the in the various Greek islands and things like that. They were the first to kind of see that. They would have been the first to recognize that, we're not going to be able to go up against these guys with the resources that are available to us. So,
and was the first major,
in fact, I think
somebody in the chat just said, but the Ottomans were crushed at Lepanto. Yeah, that's great.
I was going to bring up, was that the first major decisive victory against the Ottomans since the fall?
It's definitely the most dramatic, but actually, if I remember correctly,
there's a couple other little ones.
Yeah, there were some smaller ones between, especially between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Italians. But if I remember correctly, I think did the siege of Malta come before Lepanto?
Oh yeah, it did.
Or was that after?
No, it came before, I think.
Yeah, Malta.
Yeah, so the siege of Malta, that was really the first time that the Ottoman advance really was halted, and met a pretty significant pothole in its in its rise. So I think it was from the Turkish failure to seize Malta that there was blood in the proverbial waters, and the rest of Europe was actually had time to to scrape together the resources they would have needed to inflict a defeat like a Lepanto.
Yeah. And then another question in the chat was, could we talk about the Arab conquests in the 7th century and, sort of that time period leading up to the Fifth Crusade? That's a pretty good topic.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would say, you've got this long period where the early Middle Ages is the time when Islam is kind of the great power to a certain extent. You've got the Christian West was not so much in a position to challenge that. They weren't in a position to go on these sort of international adventures. And at the same time, even at that point, Europe wasn't entirely Christian yet. I mean, we look at Charlemagne, part of his reign involves these wars against, for example, the Saxons, who at that time were pagans. And, whatever we want to say about, Charlemagne's Saxon wars, I know a lot of people they leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. I mean, for Charlemagne, this was a pagan power that he was wanting to bring into Christendom, right? So yeah, I think the reason that the Crusades start, and there's kind of this big pushback in the late 11th century as we get into that period, is because the West is in the ascent. But before that, there was always a sense of, okay, our holy sites have been lost to these non-believers, these infidels, the followers of Muhammad, in the distant East. People talked about these stories. The biblical stories were very vivid in people's minds, the stories of Jerusalem. And, even like Charlemagne, for example, was sending funds to the Christians in the Holy Land to help them. So, there was always this sense of there's this land beyond the sea. And then it was once, Christendom kind of came sense. You've got the Christian kingdoms in Spain are suddenly becoming powerful. The kingdom of Leon is now collecting tribute from the various Muslim powers in Al-Andalus. You've got the Normans conquering Sicily. There's kind of this sudden positioning where Western Europe is capable now of engaging in these international expeditions. But anyway.
Yeah. No, I would say that's a very accurate view. It really was prior to the First Crusade. The Levant and Haute Crimea really was kind of shrouded in almost a mythical status to most Europeans. It was that's where you get the legends of Prester John and the mythical Christian king par excellence out there somewhere in the hinterlands, and it just waiting to come back in contact with Christendom, and all this kind of thing. So, it really did have a sort of almost sort of epic, kind of legendary aura to it, to a lot of them.
Yeah. And somebody in the chat just asked, did the medieval Byzantines consider themselves Greek or Roman heritage?
Our favorite.
The answer is
yes. The Byzantine Empire strikes again.
The answer to that would be both, I would say.
Very much, yeah.
They considered themselves Romans, like they saw themselves as the Roman Empire, but they also very much had an attachment to their Hellenic heritage. They used, obviously Greek was the language they were using. They were writing in Greek. They celebrated the great Greek authors like Homer. So yeah, absolutely. The Byzantines had a highly advanced, highly creative and sort of flowering civilization. Maybe flowering would be the wrong word, because it was a civilization that was very old, but they still had a very high level of civilization.
Yeah, it was a very it was.
It can you can run just looking at their Byzantine art of the time. You can see the what a distinct means of expression they had.
Oh yeah, magnificent.
Yeah. Very distinct from Central Europe and old Rome. It was entirely theirs.
Yeah, and it's you think about a church like Hagia Sophia, which that was built by Justinian. And we're talking about the 6th century. There were just no churches like that in the Western world in the early Middle Ages, and Byzantium obviously had this high level of civilization. But not to ramble about that, but
yeah.
Here's an interesting question from Mr. Jose Martinez. When and where was life best for Christians living under Muslim empires? I heard life under the Fatimids was good for Christians. Is this true?
I would say, the Fatimids definitely, they had some Christians who were in high-level administrative positions. The Fatimids were Shiites, and so they considered their primary enemy to be the Sunnis, right? Yeah. So that was their main focus, and they always had a good relationship with, well, not always. There were some wars between the Fatimids and the Byzantines, but frequently, we have some good relations between Byzantium and the Fatimids. So,
well, that brings up a question in the time, but during the First Crusade, when the Fatimids Jerusalem from the Seljuks, would you say there was an improvement in conditions for Christians there during that time?
When the Fatimids took what from the Seljuks?
Jerusalem.
Well, it was like just about a year before, right?
Yeah,
Right.
They didn't have it for very long.
I just wondered if there would have been any dramatic improvement for conditions for non-Muslims there during that brief period.
I think it would have been. It was probably a pretty rough gig, being pretty much anybody living in the Levant shortly before the First Crusade.
Yeah.
It did from pretty much the entire 11th century. The Levant was a pretty rough place to be. And that was mostly from various Muslim factions fighting each other. You had various independent Turkish warlords, constantly going back and forth with each other. You had, and back and forth with the Shiite Fatimids. So it was that would have been a rough place to be around that time for anybody of any religion. But the thing that you do have to remember is that even in Muslim societies that that did have large populations of non-Muslims living inside them, they were all still subject to the Quranic regulations regarding non-Muslims, which meant the payment of the jizya, the unbeliever tax, and things like that. Now, they probably weren't all enforced in the same way. But,
well, that's, I guess, what I was getting at. Would they have improved? Would such conditions have improved during that period for Christians in Jerusalem, in particular? Before
my guess
arrival.
Is probably not, because the Fatimids, that was a very contentious hold they had on Jerusalem. I mean, they sort of just arrived and kind of tried to get control of things. And, they knew that the Crusaders were going to attack Jerusalem. There'd been, discussion back and forth between them and the Crusaders. They tried to strike a deal with the Crusaders in which Jerusalem would remain under Fatimid control, but the Crusaders rejected that. So,
another interesting question. Somebody asked, was there ever a sort of Reconquista-like attempt to take back Africa, like the Christians did to Spain? And I would say that there were several attempts to retake Egypt during the Crusades. Obviously, most of them ended up in failure.
Are they speaking more of North Africa? What we generally think of, like Morocco, that area of Northwest Africa, Peter?
The not the Byzantines, the Normans of Sicily actually control a small sliver of North Africa.
That's must be what I'm thinking about.
Mostly around the Libyan, Tunisian coastlines, there were several attempts at sort of colonization from Sicilian Normans, various Italian city-states, and then of course Louis IX's Saint Louis IX's crusading effort, the one that he died on, was in Tunis. So
we got this the Kingdom of Africa from 1146 to 1160. It was part of the Sicilian crown. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so somebody's microphone is malfunctioning.
Can you hear me?
Sounds like Steven.
Check.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you.
Everybody's good now.
Yeah, but also in between the Second and Third Crusades, you had the campaigns of Almaric going into Egypt, and at one point he actually was able to form an alliance with Shaizar, one of the I believe the vizier of Fatimid Egypt, in the last days of that dynasty's reign.
Yeah, Amalric actually came very close to taking control of Egypt. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the Fifth Crusade, of course, as they're going through, under the command of Cardinal, I can't remember his name.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The fifth crusade, or the
Yeah, it was the Fifth Crusade. They take Damietta and then they quickly lose it because of some poor tactical decisions made by the Teutonic Knights that allowed the Muslims to defeat them there on the Nile.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Fifth Crusade. I mean, what happens is it's kind of like with the Seventh Crusade. They attempted to capture Cairo when they probably should have gone for Alexandria instead, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the biggest problem with the Egyptian crusading campaigns was that everybody kept ignoring the coast, and they would seize their one coast where they made landfall, and then they would immediately try to drive inland.
Why was that, Rand? I mean, what was the point of that?
Well, honestly, I think a lot of it just unfortunately comes down to somebody's microphone is going crazy again.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Scott.
I'm not hearing any problem with the microphone.
Okay, I think it sorted itself out now. Honestly, as far as the Egyptian issue, I think that what you really had was you just had poor command and control, and you had commanders who, maybe weren't quite the best that Europe could offer at that time. They didn't have the kind of strategic foresight that somebody like a Richard had when he drove down the Palestinian coast and he seized all the vital port cities, knowing that maritime resupply and support was going to be their main lifeline.
Yeah.
So I think it was just probably just a combination of things. A combination of inexperience. Cardinals were probably not the best people to lead armies, at that time, although, they were definitely a lot more fighting churchmen back then, but, still they probably wouldn't have had as much experience as some others did. And, and unfortunately, Louis IX, while he definitely tried, and initially, like in his planning stages, had some very sound strategic ideas. He just didn't. He was too heavily influenced by other factions around him that did not have strategic concerns as their top priority. And command and control just eventually was severely degraded as a consequence.
Yeah, and also in another case with the Fifth Crusade, I mean, I think you made a good point, Rand, about Cardinal Pelagius sort of not having the right experience. It might have been a case of Pope Honorius III wanting to have more papal control over the crusade as opposed to the control that secular kings once had. And also, the Fifth Crusade strikes me as sort of an example of just bad luck hitting the Crusaders. I mean, they get so close in their campaign, but then once this plague hits Damietta, I mean, then Al-Kamil is able to rebuild his navy. He starts ravaging and ambushing the Christian ships. King John leaves the crusade, which probably did not help with the morale of the local crusade troops. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I would just say a case of bad luck in that instance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Pelagius. We're talking about the Fifth Crusade. Pelagius got a lot of opposition from some of the noble leaders of the crusade, like there was a lot of people who didn't agree with his decision to march on Cairo. So anyway, I guess we should probably move on to another topic.
I found a interesting comment from Jin Sual. I hope I pronounced that correct. Has Real Crusade History ever thought about contacting other YouTube channels to do collaborations to increase your popularity?
I saw that too. This reminds me of a video I saw. I shared it in the group today. It was from this channel called Epic History, and they partnered up with Osprey Publishing apparently, and they produced this awesome video.
I saw that
of the First Crusade. It was fantastic. It didn't cover everything. It was just part one. It ended right before the siege of Antioch, but it was fantastic. So I mean, they don't cover primarily just medieval or Crusades history. They have videos on like the history of Russia and World War One. But
there's some other. I think there's some other folks that would possibly have some good opportunities for collaboration. One of them, I think, I've been real impressed with the. And I know I don't know how everybody else here feels about them, but I've been impressed with their quality and their production value. But Prager University, PragerU.
Oh yeah, no,
they like to do a lot of sort of like debunking, videos of very popular misconceptions and stuff. And I know they're more they're more associated with sort of contemporary conservatism, but they cover a lot of very similar topics and things like that. So
yeah,
I think there's definitely people out there who we could do collaborations with. It all depends on what works.
Yeah.
Another comment that's been appearing frequently in the chat is if we saw Stephen Crowder's video about the Crusades, and yes, we did. I shared it in.
I have not seen it actually.
No, I think you did. I told you about it, and you left a comment saying sort of. I told you to do that just so if you could like get his attention or maybe get some likes to get some attention to the channel. Didn't really work out that way, but it was fantastic. Like he pretty much takes apart all the myths. He shared a lot of the articles by Jonathan Riley Smith and Thomas Madden, and just took apart the myths of the Crusades one by one. So yeah, we've definitely seen that video.
Nice.
Somebody asked, have you thought about contacting more Crusade historians like Thomas Madden and Helen Nicholson? Yes, I actually have spoken with Helen Nicholson. I have asked her to come on the podcast, and she said to get back with her when she is done writing her current book. So,
do we know what book she's writing right now?
She's working on something. I think it's about the Templars again, or the military orders in some way. But
yeah, I think I've seen mention of that somewhere about her latest works, upcoming works. And I think you're right. I think it is something on the Knights Templar.
Yeah,
but she is open to coming on for a chat then, Stephen.
Yeah. She said she would like to, but it's just she's very pressed for time at the moment. Right. But she's somebody we would love to have on. Thomas Madden, I have not asked. I probably should though. We should probably email him and see if he could.
Well, he is, from what I've heard, an approachable individual.
Yeah. So let's see.
Apparently, according to Mr. Baghead 777, Sargon mentioned us once.
I just saw that. Do you know what video he mentioned us? In?
Yeah, if somebody could find that and link it to us, we'd appreciate it. I'm not sure if it's going to be positive or not, but
well, I talk with Sargon on Twitter every now and then.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's interesting.
He's a good guy. I'm hoping someday when our schedules are compatible, we can kind of collaboration together. I know he's open to it. So
yeah.
Somebody says, what advice would you give to a high schooler aspiring to be a medieval historian? I would say start taking Latin and take as much Latin as you possibly can and learn your Latin. Latin and also probably French and German. So
French a close second. French or German a close second.
Right.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Latin is going to be your primary language you're going to need to get, and you're going to need to work with French and German too. So,
and it's trying to get into professional medieval historical study. It's one of the things that prevented me from actually pursuing a master's in medieval studies, and why I had to switch to military history, because unfortunately most medieval studies graduate programs require competency in either Latin, Greek, or one of the medieval vernacular languages. So definitely the language piece is a huge prerequisite.
Yeah.
Another question that was interesting was somebody asked was why didn't Russia get more involved into the Crusades, considering that they considered themselves to be like the third Rome. I was wondering.
Well, the easy answer to that question is because unfortunately during the majority of the crusading period, first off, Russia did not yet consider itself the third Rome. You really didn't see that identity come about until one of the Russian czars marries the last Byzantine princess in shortly after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, or shortly before, either one. So that identity of the third Rome, you really don't see that in the vast majority of the crusading era for Russian history. What you do see is Russia at that time wasn't even really a united country. Russia was a series of several small principalities: Novgorod, Kiev,
Moscow,
some other smaller, Moscow, Ryazan, so some very small ones, and then right about the time when many of the Russian principalities start to come into their own around the around the early 1200s, the Mongols show up and just completely wipe out. The Principality of Kiev gets completely wiped out. Ryazan, even Moscow is seized. The area around Moscow is seized for a time. The only one who really survives with its head above water is the Principality of Novgorod. And even they become a tributary state to the Golden Horde. So and the Mongols wouldn't be driven out until I want to say sometime around the late 1300s. So they were busy with other things.
Yeah, it's really, I think we get in the 18th century, and that's when we see Russia kind of heat up its identity as this kind of great empire, and Russia put the hurt on the Ottoman Turks during that period. So
yeah,
and before that, Russia actually became a vassal state of the Mongols, so they couldn't really do much.
Certain Russian territories did,
certain
like other people.
Certain territories did.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, like other people, and like we're seeing in the chat, people are talking about how Russia wasn't necessarily one united region.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was a whole series of smaller principalities and and chiefdoms and things like that.
That's true.
Yeah. Let's see. Do we have any other questions coming in to the chat? Let's get some questions, folks.
Let's see. How accurate is Wikipedia, from Michael Well?
I've been on here, and it
varies widely.
They source like Christopher and stuff. I don't know. It depends.
Wikipedia is a great source if you want to just get a very, very cursory overview with dates, places, names, sort of the big blue arrow picture of history. But unfortunately, if you want to actually use it as a scholarly source, you don't even try. Like it's not reliable. The scholarship isn't reliable. It's not. You get way too much. You get way too much agenda typically, as opposed to scholarship. It can also be good, depending on what you're looking for. It can also be good for finding sources on things. If you go down to certain articles and you go down to like the sources cited sections and stuff like that, you can find authors and books and things like that are related to a certain topic that may be of value. But unfortunately, the articles themselves are typically problematic at best. So.
And somebody just asked, how were Muslims treated in Christian European kingdoms? I'm assuming we're talking about like areas where they actually lived. For example, like the Kingdom of Aragon, the Kingdom of Castile, Kingdom of Sicily. Yeah, the answer to that would be, I would say, they were treated well. I mean, they were tolerated. They were allowed to practice their own religion. They had to pay taxes, and obviously they had to submit to to Christian rule. Really, it's a similar condition that a lot of Christians found themselves in, living under Muslim rule.
With one very, very important distinction, and that is that you did not have any religiously mandated, for lack of a better term, discrimination against non-Christians within Christian kingdoms, with the exception of in the later, I want to say it was around the mid 1200s, is where you start to see the laws within certain Christian kingdoms, like in France, certain places in Germany, of like the identification of Jews, where Jews couldn't wear they couldn't wear Christian dress, and things like that, and they couldn't non-Christian males could not marry Christian women. Now Christian men could marry non-Christian women,
right,
in most of those places, but non-Christian men were barred from marrying Christian women. And then of course there were some pretty severe penalties if it was implied, if it was proven that they had caused or persuaded a Christian to apostatize. There were some pretty stiff penalties for that, but for the most part, you didn't really see the kind of entrenched systematic discrimination against non-Christians. It was really only kind of in fits and starts, with very certain particular incidents, like the Edward I, banishing the Jews, expelling the Jews from England, and things like that. So other than those, you didn't, there was no like established systemic discrimination.
Well, there was a Christian or Muslims and Jews were expelled from Jerusalem immediately after the First Crusade.
Yeah, Jerusalem was kind of an unusual case, though. Jerusalem was reserved for Christians in the Crusader states, but pretty much in the entire rest of the region.
Yeah.
In the Kingdom of Jerusalem and all these other cities.
And even the city of Jerusalem, that didn't last for very long.
Because, that's what I was wondering.
Almost a generation after the First Crusade, you have records talking about very sizable Jewish and Muslim communities living in Jerusalem, and apparently getting along quite well.
Like inside of the city, or like in the surrounding suburbs.
There was who was the one Islamic chronicler, and I know he came a little bit later, but he talked about being able to pray, near the Templar commandery. They're near the Holy Sepulchre, or they're near the Alaska Mosque, and the Templars even that he was even like personal. He even got along personally with several of the Knight brothers.
The Templars had Muslim scribes, and the Grand Masters often had Muslims within their entourage as sort of like an advisor.
Yeah.
Okay, and then somebody else asked about the Children's Crusade. That's one of my favorite topics because it shows how people don't understand the Middle Ages when they bring up the Children's Crusade. I don't remember. I was watching some video the other day where somebody used the Children's Crusade as an example of how medieval people could get into this fervor. They're like, well, think about that, just sending off all these children off on crusade. How crazy. The answer to that is that never happened. There wasn't
the Children's Crusade didn't exist.
The Children's Crusade is a story. It's a storytelling tradition from the medieval era about this concept of like the poor and the meek and the humble being able to overthrow God's empire.
Exactly.
And that's all it is. I mean, it never happened. So
it's pretty bad when you have scholarly writers from the time, people like Roger Bacon, and people like that saying that this was a myth. And he's writing in the mid 1200s. So it unfortunately is it is just that it's a pious myth that probably came from
It have some basis in fact, didn't it, Rand?
Which it did, and that's why they talk about the children's crusade really being more of sort of like an innocence crusade, meaning like the poor,
like
the landless,
it was
exactly the humble, the humble poor people, who were sort of the grassroots movement of the Crusades, of all the Crusades, until the very end. So it was probably more of a metaphor rather than than an actual event.
Yeah. And somebody else just asked, how did the Catholics consider the Orthodox Christians after the East-West Schism, especially during the First Crusade? Were they considered as heathens, and did this encourage the Fourth Crusade? I would say, I don't know what you guys think, but I would say that you've got every possible view about the Byzantine world from the Latin. You've got people who view them as brother Christians. These are our brothers in Christ. The Byzantine emperors are great men. They are Christian kings. And you've got people who view them as heretics. So it's kind of like everything else with this history. It's complicated.
Yeah, it was a very, very fitful relationship. It was one, unfortunately marked from the very beginning with, a lot of distrust on both sides, and a lot of cultural differences that were not very compatible with one another. The Christians in the East spoke Greek, the Christians in the West spoke Latin. It was just, they had very different liturgies. They had very different traditions, and things like that. So it was a very, as the Facebook status says, it's complicated. Like
even among the chroniclers of the First Crusade, we get different attitudes. Like Fulcher of Chartres, for example, he has a very pro-Byzantine attitude. He's very positive about Emperor Alexius. But then you get like the author of the Gesta Francorum, the Norman Chronicle. He's very hostile toward the Byzantines. So even just in that little, even among the First Crusaders, you've got different attitudes about the Byzantines.
Yeah.
So and then
I've got a great comment here, great question here from Machiavelli PL. What do you think about the idea that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was the first episode of European colonialism?
I would say no.
Yeah, absolutely not. That is in fact, that's something that a lot of more recent Crusades historians and Crusade scholars actually attack, is this idea, because it was kind of a trope from the older, more outdated views of the Crusades. Is they were these excuses for colonial adventures, masked under religion and all this kind of thing. And really, they weren't at all. Unfortunately, it's a view that's perpetuated by people who, subscribe to a certain view of history. The leftist, more sort of socialist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, visions of, the Howard Zinn school of history, and the problem is that the ideas of colonialism and that were a product of 19th century nationalism, secular nationalism, by the way, that those concepts didn't even exist in medieval Europe. They didn't. The concept of the nation state didn't exist in Crusades era Europe. It wasn't the social hierarchy was a much more organic, localized phenomenon that didn't, and they didn't buy into things like, schools of racial superiority or any of that kind of nonsense. It wasn't there. It was hey, we're Christian, and this is a duty of ours, to go make safe, of Christ's earthly life, and that was something that was very palpable to them. It was very real to them. It was something worth even going off and fighting and dying for. So, But as far as like, were they out there to try and create some sort of overseas empire? No, like that wasn't. They wanted to keep the holy sites safe. They wanted to keep Jerusalem safe, and that was about it.
But there are things that like the taking of Edessa and that territory, and then Bohemon's hanging on to Antioch. Those things could be kind of interpreted. They're kind of like territorial grabs.
Well, I mean, they were just kind of normal medieval conquests. I mean,
right, but I mean, it could be, those things could be taken out of context and interpreted as colonialism.
You could, but again, it's not really colonialism. It's
I know. It's just someone could give that as an example. As an example of colonialism. Okay, these guys went off on their own and conquered their own territories, established their own, Crusader principalities, which would, eventually become the Crusader state. So I'm just saying it could be easily taken out of context. It could be fun to look like colonialism.
Yeah, but you'd have to remember that that back in that time, knights and nobles, the only way they could support themselves was through the actual ownership of land. So those guys had nothing to go back to in Europe.
Right.
Bowman pretty much gave up everything that he had in Italy to go on crusade.
And I think if we look at like the county of Edessa, for example, what Baldwin did he had a very small group of knights with him. He had like a handful of knights. It was like 60 or something ridiculous. And he basically got into a alliance with a group of local Armenians. So he very much incorporated himself into the Armenian ruling class of Edessa.
He even married an Armenian, if I remember correctly. He married an Armenian noblewoman.
Yeah, Arda of something. Yeah, he did.
God bless him.
And of course, he became the adopted son of the ruler there, Thoros. You know that story?
Yeah, he rubbed his chest on Thoros.
Yeah, they put on this shirt together, but yeah, it's really a bizarre story. But,
that was the weirdest story when I was reading about that part of history. Just
I love stuff like that from medieval history. It makes it so
cool. It is. And then of course it was, Thoros was later deposed and
it was probably something that when it was happening, Baldwin was probably just like, okay, all right, I'll just roll with this. Like,
I guess my whole point is that things like that, and then Bohemon's, his dealings at Antioch and that type of things. Those could be spun by people, to say, okay, well, the Crusades were, they did have a colonial ambitions. The nobles had colonial. I guess that's my point.
I guess another question is colonialism necessarily bad? I mean,
depends.
Why do we look back on Europe's colonial enterprises as negative? I mean, they had almost a universally positive influence on the territories they
and that's
not politically correct these days. I mean,
that's true. That's very true. Yeah.
Well, for one thing, I mean,
I think it's more the popular perception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they were bad for Europe ultimately because they. Anyway, Peter, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say it depends on, what aspects of colonialism are we talking about? I mean, if we're talking about, sort of the more brutal genocidal kind of regimes that we saw, in terms of like the Belgian Congo, then no, I would say that definitely was a bad part, and the conquest of indigenous peoples as well. But if we're talking about things like, bringing literacy, bringing culture and civilization to countries and building them up to the point where when the original colonists left, the countries were in a much better state than they were previously. And I would say those are actually really, I would say positive effects. Sort of unintentional, but
yeah.
In a way, I think you can look at colonialism maybe in the same, or just imperialism. The concept of empires, overseas empires. You can look at it in a way similar to how you can look at actual warfare. Is it intrinsically wrong, or does it depend on the conditions? Are there conditions in which it could be a positive? It can be a positive force.
Yeah. We better get back to the Crusades, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Somebody asked a great question earlier. Does somebody else have a question they want to do? But this is a really good one.
What was it?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Somebody asked, how did Muslim armies deal with the Frankish cavalry charge? That's a good question. Who wants to go first?
Wasn't it mainly countered by the...
I'll bite.
Well, Peter, what were you going to say?
Sorry, Rand can go ahead first.
Okay, Rand, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess with that question, it depends on what era we're talking about, because early on, when they first encountered each other, there was a lot of both sides trying to figure out how to deal with the other and how to respond to the other. The two traditions, the two military traditions of the Islamic East and the Frankish Latin West at that time, especially around the 11th century, were almost diametrically opposite one another. The West favored a military tradition that was very melee oriented. It was very shock oriented. It was very heavily armored. Had a lot of emphasis on heavy armor and close combat. Close combat. Whereas the Islamic East, and actually not just the Islamic East, but many of the more Eastern cultures had a tradition of skirmishing and of standoff.
Ranged weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ranged weapons. Hit and run tactics. Feinted charges and feinted retreats and things like that. So, and their equipment on both sides emphasized both those traditions. The Latin Franks were they were known for their heavy armor. The Muslim chroniclers even called them the men of steel. And they would talk about shooting arrows at them, and there was no impact. If they were wearing chainmail and things like that. So, whereas the Islamic armies had very, very light armor, and they emphasized speed and mobility and agility and things like that. So, much has been made of the Islamic forces always had the upper edge because they were faster and than these lumbering slow Western knights and things like that, but that's not actually necessarily very accurate. Actually, the Islamic forces feared coming in close contact with the Latin Crusaders because they knew that in melee fighting they didn't stand a chance against the West's heavier armor. So typically, what they would try to do is and you saw this in multiple engagements. And sometimes it was successful, and sometimes it wasn't. But you saw the Islamic forces would try to harass Western armies, and they would try to goad knights, especially the mounted knights, to break out and to split up and go and chase after them, and try to get them to pursue them with feigned retreats and things like that, where they could then sort of surround them and overwhelm them. And like I said, sometimes it was successful and sometimes it wasn't. It all depended on the timing, it depended on the terrain, it depended on how quick they were or lack thereof. And there were plenty of times where that didn't work. And if the Western Knights were able to get a decent charge in, sometimes that could decide the entire engagement. That's what you saw at battles like Montcassard, where a charge of 500 mounted knights almost wipes out Salahadin's entire army. So it was very hit and miss. So sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And but eventually later on, yep.
Oh, you're probably getting to the same thing. I mean, they eventually barred from the other, and you saw it was
Exactly. Yeah, you did
cavalry
later
charge.
on. You did start to see some cross pollination between the two traditions, and that's where you like in the later Mamluk eras, you start to see some very heavy cavalry, almost like cataphractoi type, heavy armored cavalry, with lances, obviously modeled off of both Greek and Latin uh, uh, military, knights and stuff like that. So you do start to see some cross pollination, but for the most part, that distinction lasted pretty much the whole time they were in contact with each other.
Yeah. So somebody asked about infantry and the use of infantry by the Crusaders. That's a really interesting point. Infantry was hugely important, especially in the Latin East, and yet there used to be this idea that medieval infantries were kind of these untrained rabbles, and that's not true at all. Infantries were very highly skilled. The infantry tactics were very well organized in the Crusader states. The way that infantry were used, I mean, first of all, they were used for archery. When you had distance fighting, like as two armies were meeting, that would often be the first thing that would happen would be an archery exchange. But you would also have infantry acting as kind of like a shield wall almost. Like they would protect the knights. They would march close to the knights. They would march in a formation that would allow their shields to protect the knights. And also, there were maneuvers that were used with crossbow, where crossbow would be used to fire, interspersed within these walls of infantry. And if once the moment was right, once, for example, if the Crusaders could draw the Muslims in close, then there would be a signal given, like a horn would be blown or something like that, and the infantry could move aside, and the cavalry would deliver their charge at that point. So there was incredible coordination and highly, military strategy was just as advanced in the Middle Ages as at any point in history. Really,
very, very much so. In fact, in some ways, to think that they were able to accomplish the things that they did without the benefits of the technology and the logistics capability that we have today, really is kind of incredible. To think that they were still able to do what they did, so professionally.
Absolutely.
But yeah, unfortunately, medieval infantry often gets a very poor treatment in in popular history, because it's it is, unfortunately, Hollywood leaves us with this image of the untrained peasant rabble,
basically arrow fodder.
This guy goes, so the infantry baited the Muslims into committing their forces, and then the knights rode out to trample them, like at Arsuf. I mean, kind of. Yeah, I mean, the idea was you provide this protective screen, and as we know, this was a very effective tactic. Like, when the Crusaders would keep these tight formations, it would be very difficult for the Muslims to disrupt them. Yeah. So they could march in and out of territory, for example. It'd be slow moving, but they could do that very effectively, and as long as they didn't charge, too quickly or something like that, it worked very well. And somebody just typed awkward moment of silence. Okay, you know what? If there's like a little moment of silence here and there, that's okay. This is raw. This is live. This is back. This isn't like one of our formal videos.
Don't think of it as an awkward moment of silence. Think of it as a pause for reflection.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was pausing in reflection of how brilliant everything ran today was.
Now, I believe that was sarcasm. So that's
no,
really. But getting back to infantry, Rand. Now, we always get the impression, like through Hollywood and everything, that the infantry were just these poor peasants with pitchforks, and they were just basically what you'd call cannon fodder in later ages. But what status would they have actually have enjoyed, in relation to the to the noble class or the knightly class?
Sure, it
I mean,
actually depends on what
the status as being highly trained professionals. Was that taken into account?
Very much so. You had, in fact, I noticed it in an earlier question to us. But there were mercenary bands of infantry, even as early as the 11th century, who had reputations that preceded them all over Europe. And these were commoners. These weren't noblemen. A lot of the infantry from Brabant in what's now the Low Countries were renowned all throughout the early and high medieval periods for the high quality infantrymen infantry pikemen that they often supplied. They were very much in demand with kings and lords all over Europe. Later on, you had many of the Italian city-states who produced, high quality specialist troops. The Genoan crossbowmen, they were active as early as the First Crusade.
Oh, right.
And stuff like that. So you had these bands of specialists who, in a lot of ways, war was their profession. And if that's their profession, they're going to make sure they're going to be really good at it.
So then, they were viewed as professional soldiers then.
Absolutely.
You say at the time of the First Crusade, there was a corps of professional infantry that were as good, as skilled as what they did as the knights were.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and they filled certain battlefield roles that knights couldn't.
Right.
Heavy cavalry is a great battlefield multiplier if you use it in the specific instances in which it's in which it's made for. Mounted heavy cavalry is not going to be very good. It's not going to be very effective if after their initial charge they get bogged down. Amidst infantry that's standing their ground. In fact, at that point, it's going to turn into a slaughter.
Yeah.
Knights were great as a shock force. They were great for delivering that hammer blow of a charge. Within at a certain focal point. Within the fight, but if it wasn't followed up, if it wasn't backed up by solid infantry on foot, for the most part, those charges would be worthless.
Yeah, and
go ahead, Joe.
At Arsuf, after the cavalry mowed down the Muslims, the Crusader infantry went up and they'd go through and stab everybody who was laying there on the ground and stuff, and just finish everybody off. And that was another important role that the infantry played.
Then of course
that was another important role. To make sure they were
Antioch when horses were at a premium and a lot of knights were forced to fight on foot.
True.
And this guy goes, "Why didn't the Crusaders just use machine guns to take Jerusalem?"
I always say that when I'm watching Game of Thrones. I'm like, dude, just pull out your M16. Anyway, Rand, we were talking about this in the group a little while ago. We were talking about sort of how you would define Templar Sergeants. And I don't remember the exact terminology. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you about specifically, what was the difference in skill level between, say, standard infantry in the service of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and that of the Templar Sergeants?
Well, first off, not all Templar Sergeants were actual combatants. A lot of Templar Sergeants were the sort of the specialists. Supply, logistics, blacksmiths, farriers, craftsmen, carpenters. The types that would be classified as what we would call combat service support. Today.
Right.
The non-combat arms support that all armies ultimately rely on.
Mm-hmm.
But there definitely were specialist infantry types amongst the sergeants. You had crossbowmen, you had archers, you had support, regular, what will probably be called regular infantry,
Pikemen,
that sort of thing.
Yeah, and did some of them? Did any of them take part in the cavalry at all? Like a support cavalry, maybe?
Yes, there were. A lot of them were. I think somebody's got their microphone on it. I'm hearing myself echo back.
Mine is not on.
Okay. I'll just keep going. A lot of what would have been considered like the squires, the shield bearers, the lance bearers for the actual knight brothers would have been sergeants as well. Although at times they were also novice knight brothers. I believe the term for them was the confrere brothers, the brothers who hadn't taken permanent vows yet. Would fill that role sometimes, to give them some battlefield experience, alongside the actual knight brothers that they would eventually become. So you did have some of those, but there were sergeants who did act as the squires to the knight brothers.
Yeah. Oh, and anyway, there's somebody in the chat, Robert Richardson, who was saying, what was their original purpose? The Templars, that is. I was told the Templar Order was originally meant to protect pilgrims in Outremer. And yes, that's absolutely what the original purpose of the Templars was. Right back when the King of Jerusalem was first starting out, there was a problem in Outremer for Christian pilgrims who were on their way to Jerusalem, obviously, from Saracen raids. And at this point in time, the King of Jerusalem didn't really have the support to really defend itself and also look out for the pilgrims. So, as well as the fact that a lot of knights that would come on crusade would, after they were done with the first crusade, would return home. So they needed an order of knights that would be able to stand watch over the pilgrims indefinitely. So that's when you have Hugh of Payen and a few others, I can't remember the name, Andre de Montbard and a few others go to Baldwin II and propose this idea of the Templar Order.
Well, and something to remember about the not only the Templars, but also once they became militarized, the Knights Hospitaller and some of the other lesser known military orders, was that they were filling a vacuum. They were filling a very critical vacuum in those early years of the Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land that actually enabled them to become probably some of the most professionalized military forces in medieval Europe at that time.
Exactly.
The Knights Templar and the Hospitallers had a military reputation that was probably unmatched by anybody else.
They were constantly exposed to combat in that area,
exactly.
So they were looked upon for advice.
And they almost had a military hierarchy and a military structure and tradition that was actually quite a bit ahead of their time.
Really?
One could almost say has some echoes in almost more modern, professionalized, military traditions where, a very strict hierarchy, discipline, order, an entire regimen of an entire daily routine that focused on military training and things like that. So they were almost a sort of a proto modern military organization. Although I'm sure there's some historians out there that would have a conniption if they heard me say that, but it's not a totally inaccurate observation to make.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, somebody goes, "Hey, RCH, how did you first hear of the Crusades, and why take such an interest in it?" I guess that's directed at me. I guess I am.
Yeah, that question's all yours.
Isabel I of Castile is what got me interested in the Crusades. In fact, that's what got me interested in the Middle Ages. I just kind of stumbled upon a book about her by William Thomas Walsh, and it just the whole thing just kind of fascinated me. I mean, the idea of this long crusade to retake Spain from the Arabs, and Isabel I of Castile, she's kind of got a lot of the personality traits and virtues that make a medieval monarch interesting and compelling. Her horsemanship, the fact that she was kind of there in the thick of the campaigning. I mean, she never, of course, was involved in combat herself, but she was heavily involved in keeping the army supplied, and she'd go into the camp and tend to the wounded men herself, with her own hands. The queen. It's just kind of fascinating. But yeah, I mean that's what got me interested in the Crusades. I think the thing that's interesting about the Crusades for me too is, one, it's so different than how we are used to thinking about warfare. People in our culture, they find the Crusades, somewhere between horrifying and perplexing frequently, but it was so in line with the ethos and the mentality of the medieval world, and it's just they were tapped into something that's totally different from our worldview, and it's just kind of fascinating. And sort of the blending of this kind of like violent, bloody military conflict with this most cherished of spirituality and kind of this personal piety. It's kind of it's a powerful thing. It's not your typical military topic by any means. It blends a lot of there's a lot there. There's a lot of meat there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things about the Crusades, and even just about medieval history in general, that like you said, Stephen, when you get into it, it has an epicness to it. It has a draw to it that even despite the modern cynicism that that exists today regarding it, people are still drawn to, almost kind of instinctively. It is, and I've witnessed it not only with myself but also with a lot of other people, that there's an instinctive draw to kind of all things medieval. At the end of the day, some of it's kind of dysfunctional, but so some of that attraction, but it's there. It's a very potent force with a lot of people.
Yeah, Rand, that's actually a really good point, because over like the past year and a half that I've been studying the Crusades again, I just like, besides the fact that I wanted to set the record straight on what the correct history was, I noticed that in the process just how interesting everything was and how similar it was. The King of Jerusalem, for example, and just the politics around how similar that was to what you see on Game of Thrones. All the intrigue, all the sort of cutthroat politics, the sort of the exciting, like, you've got the Templars siding with one nobleman and the Hospitallers with another, and then they've got an ally with some Muslim ruler. Think Amalric and Shaizar. All this kind of stuff, and it's really rich, and like you said, there's a sense of epicness to it. You think of just Christendom, right before the First Crusade. It's like their last stand for their civilization against the Mohammedans, and Pope Urban calls that crusade, and then off we go.
Yeah, it's a very powerful concept, definitely. And there's a sense of this is warfare for a higher purpose. Whatever you want to say about the Crusades, that is how they thought of it. To them, this was the higher calling. If somebody was engaged in war with just their neighbor, the count of, whatever, who kind of bugged them, there was always a sense that, what you should be doing is you should be fighting God's war.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of the ultimate. It was kind of the ultimate guilt trip, phrase. It was like, well, what you really should be doing.
What you really.
Yeah. I know your neighbor, the count of Saint whatever, kind of bugs you, but really, you should be off fighting the Saracens.
Will somebody please think of Jerusalem?
Right, yeah. Kind of in the way that we think about, you should go off and help the poor, starving Africans. For them, that this was the charitable work. This was.
There was no white privilege back then.
No. White privilege was their birthright back then.
Very true.
Anyway, guys.
There actually was a. Oh, do you need to head out?
Yeah, I do actually. I was about to say.
Okay, Peter.
It was great chatting with you guys. And I look forward to seeing the rest of this.
Great to talk to you, Peter.
You too, Scott.
Absolutely, yeah. And hey, everybody who's been commenting and whatnot, give Mr. Peter Sefrin a nice send off, and thanks for being a part of this. So
absolutely. I will talk to you guys soon. Des Volt, and have a good one.
All right, Peter.
All right, later, Peter.
Yeah. That's our intern Peter Safarian there.
There was one question that caught my eye here from Jack Margiotta. Many people say that the Muslims kept the ancient Greek and Roman classical texts, and the Crusaders discovered them from the Muslims. Is that true?
It would be true for some of them, right, Rand?
Yeah, it would. And it's unfortunately, this is one of those very common misconceptions that's been paraded all throughout modern historians of the Western Europeans wouldn't have any learning if it weren't for the Muslims that preserved all the stuff from the Greeks and the Romans and yada yada yada. Unfortunately, that's very far from the reality. Western Europe did a very good job preserving a lot of the learning and the intellectual life from the previous classical world. That's pretty much how the monasteries came into existence. Was the monastic schools and things like that. So that preserved quite a lot, and all throughout what many people would call the Dark Ages, there actually was a lot of preservation that occurred. There were a few things that did get separated, especially when you had the Islamic conquests of Egypt and of the Byzantine East. That it did delay their reception in the West by a few centuries. The biggest one of those was a lot of the works of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had been known to the West and his thought, but unfortunately, there were certain works that the West was unaware of, that they eventually came into contact with in Al-Andalus in Spain. From Muslim and Jewish scholars, the primary of which being Averroes, and then Maimonides, and then the Jewish scholar Maimonides, who brought they brought those works of Aristotle that the West had been missing, and so it really completed the picture of Aristotle's thought. And then it was the study of that by figures like Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics that started that whole philosophical tradition. So there were some works from the classical world that we did get through through some cross-cultural dialogue with the Muslims. But this idea that like all of it came from them is horribly inaccurate. And,
well, I mean, it seems like they appropriated so much from the West during their first great wave of conquest, and then it was just kind of reinvented to give this picture of this advanced Muslim where they had actually appropriated much of it from conquered areas.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, we think about the flowering of Arab civilization in the early Middle Ages. That was a process of the Arabs. They took control of these very highly advanced portions of the Roman Empire, right? I mean, like Syria, Syria,
or Spain, whatever. Descendants of the Roman Empire. Then, I mean, that essentially came as desert barbarians, and took what they found and then developed their own so-called intellectual culture as the centuries passed, and it's been kind of sold as the other way around.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, like for example, the intellectual achievements in Al-Andalus are absolutely impressive. I mean, I would never want to denigrate that or something. I think there was a process by which for example, in Sicily and in Spain, the Latin West did bring in some of this intellectual tradition, but it is true too that intellectual tradition originated with the Christian Roman Empire.
That's the point.
That's exactly. That's
and the Muslims. I mean, they borrowed. I mean, they assimilated that. Yeah.
So I think it's kind of like sometimes you hear people trying to say that almost as a way to denigrate the Latin West, like, oh well, they had to get but that seems silly to me. I mean, these processes of how knowledge and learning get handed through different civilizations, it goes from one civilization to another, and the Arabs certainly received their intellectual heritage, or the start of it, through the Persians and the Romans.
Right.
So yeah, I mean that's an interesting topic, and I think it's actually pretty interesting. You look at Aquinas and how he was reading Averroes, and I mean it's kind of a fascinating process. How that took place, and Aquinas he loved some of those Arab authors, and
well, he called he often had he often had very respectful names by which he would refer to them all as the learned Averroes and stuff like that. Like he held them in very high regard. As a fellow intellectual. So and that also just obliterates this notion of the Christian medieval West was so intolerant and just hated people who were of other religions and cultures. It's like no, actually no, they weren't. Like
they were very to make use of Arab learning. So.
Yeah.
And this guy, somebody in the chat says Romans did the same thing. Well, of course, absolutely. In fact, the Romans kind of inherited their intellectual tradition from the Greeks, really.
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
And I think if we want to talk about where a lot of this sort of the intellectual heritage of the West really does start. I mean, yeah, the Greeks, there is stuff that starts there, with the classical Greeks that is, it's pretty mind blowing. I mean, that's kind of the big beginning of all this. So yeah, interesting topics.
Good thing Socrates actually drank the hemlock.
Let's see. Were there any Muslim primary sources at the time of the First Crusade, or were they all from the succeeding decades and centuries? Because it seems like it was barely noticed. There's one I can think of, and that's Ibn al-Qalanisi.
Yeah.
He's the only one who actually was a contemporary.
Something you got to remember is that, unfortunately, there may have been a lot more, and there most probably were. It's just, how many have survived all the way to today? Very few. So,
yeah, and it's interesting because, like Jacob Jones here says, Ibn al-Qalanisi's account of the First Crusade is quite laconic. It's quite brief. He doesn't really linger on it. He doesn't linger on the taking of Jerusalem as though it were some sort of, oftentimes we hear this idea that, the taking of Jerusalem caused this almost like a lightning rod effect through the Muslim world. It was felt everywhere. It traumatized everyone. We don't really get evidence of that from this.
In fact, what little evidence we do have, it almost suggests the opposite, that it was just kind of a meh, like
more of a blip than anything.
Yeah, it was over time.
At least for a while, it was a blip.
Yeah, it's interesting. The later Muslim authors inflate the event more. Like, you look at somebody like Ibn al-Athir and Baha'u'ddin, not Baha'u'ddin, he didn't write about it, but some of these later Muslim chroniclers.
The Christian occupation of the Western Christian occupation of Jerusalem did very much turn into a
rallying cry for jihad.
A rallying cry, yeah, exactly. A rallying cry for later Islamic political figures. So that by the time of Baybars and like the final, the final end of the Latin Crusader kingdoms, it's this huge deal. It's this, the reconquest of Jerusalem, the rescue of the Holy Land from these, Christian, infidels and stuff like that is this huge deal. But yeah, back when it very first fell, you're right. There wasn't really a whole lot of there wasn't a whole lot of tears shed, over it from what it seems.
And it's interesting. I mean, like shortly after, 15 years after the First Crusade in 1115, we've got the ruler of Damascus, Toktekin, and Il-Ghazi, who controls Aleppo and some of those regions. They actually form an alliance with the Principality of Antioch in the Kingdom of Jerusalem to prevent Baghdad from sending in an army to control.
Exactly. They were still primarily concerned with their own feuds with one another than they were with dealing with the Frankish Crusaders. In fact, many times you almost see them kind of using the pretext of the Frankish Crusaders being there to actually go after fellow Muslims. It's a weird, it's a very weird dynamic. Those first couple of decades of the Frankish Holy Land.
But when would you say that the Muslim world began to actually become more united, Rand? What was the turning point?
I mean, Saladin was really
leading up to Saladin.
Yeah, he was kind of really maybe not Saladin, but maybe more his Nuruddin. Yeah, Nuruddin was kind of really the first major figure to kind of use, the presence, the Frankish presence in Outremer as this rallying cry. And really even they weren't able to really unite the Muslims. They really, if you really look at the accounts, especially the more honest accounts of Saladin, like Ibn al-Athir's account, they really just kind of guilt tripped all their fellow Muslims into oh, well, you're not a real Muslim if you don't come help me fight the Franks in Outremer, and and it was kind of like this. All their coalitions were all very begrudging. At that point, it was just kind of like, okay, fine, we'll help you, if you just shut up.
I think too, like Saladin used that as a type of, I mean, he may very well have been sincere about it. He may have been a sincere jihadist. He held it as very dear in his heart to retake, this territory from the Crusaders, but he certainly used it as effective propaganda, right?
Exactly.
Saladin was in the process of illegitimately taking control of the Zengid state, right? He had dispossessed the heirs of Nur-ad-Din, Nur-ad-Din, who had been his sponsor, to send him to Egypt. And so he was really viewed as illegitimate by a large swathe of like Sunni Syria and a lot of these territories. And so he needed something to give him legitimacy. And I think part of the way he did that was through this concept of jihad. And his career, he looks like he was mostly more concerned with subduing his Sunni rivals, for most of his career. He did at the end there, once he had, Damascus and Aleppo and Egypt, he did make a really hard push against the Crusaders, and
Yes.
but yeah, anyway, that's pretty much it. You go ahead, Rand.
No, you summed it up rather nicely. That really was pretty much it. And even with successive Muslim leaders, you still saw that. Even with somebody as championed as Baybars. I mean, Baybars' primary concern seems to have been primarily with his fellow Muslims, not so much with the Frankish West. So.
And somebody asked in the chat, were the Hasheshin ever a real threat to the Crusader leaders? I would say the Hasheshin were focused on the Sunnis. Again, they are a Shiite sect, and so their main focus was always on disrupting Sunni power, right?
Yeah, very much so. And they were never in the kinds of numbers, or they never quite had the I guess the operational reach, for lack of a better term,
they couldn't field like huge armies.
Yeah, they couldn't field huge armies. They, despite all the unfortunate Assassin's Creed franchise that we've all been exposed to. I apologize if there's any fans of that game listening in on or anything like that. But it really the history is really horrible. They weren't these they weren't these mythical pseudo ninjas that could wipe out anybody or anything like that. They actually were a lot less dramatic than they were made out to be. And they were always just kind of like they were always just kind of there up for the highest bidder. It was just sort of like whoever could pay them the most is who they would do stuff for, and that was about it.
Now, Rand, when were they finally wiped out?
That would have been the Mongols. That would have been Hulagu Khan.
Okay. Interesting.
They had a well, actually, that's actually not entirely true. Hulagu Khan definitely took their citadel, but actually, I believe the final end, they were the settlement and the fortress was finally, no kidding, sacked with I want to say it was one of the later Mongols, or I'd have to look it up, but it was primarily when the Mongols showed up in the area, they very quickly were put in their place, and reminded just how not very powerful they really were. So
yeah. Let's see. And somebody else asked something interesting up here. Let me get back to it. Discuss just war theory and why not fighting Muslims would have been sinful. That's kind of an interesting topic. I think to an extent, yeah. The popes, when the popes were calling crusades, yeah, they would say, if you don't, that's something they would say to encourage the knightly classes to get involved. If you don't do this, it is sinful. It's a neglect of your duty to fight the enemies of Christendom, to protect Christendom. Especially like if instead you're involving yourself in one of these petty local wars that's damaging to Christendom. Interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would
very much so. I mean,
yeah.
Well, and the concept of just war is something that in terms of Catholicism, it goes all the way back to Saint Augustine in the City of God. That he wrote in the early 400s, where he talks about the concept of peace. It's not, peace doesn't just mean the absence of violence. Peace means the tranquility of order, or the Latin phrase tranquilitas ordinis. And that had this, it created this concept of, hey, in a fallen world, and where there's sin and there's, and human nature is fallen and things like that, that there are times in which it is necessary to, in order to preserve the tranquility of order, the state must take certain violent actions to ensure that that's actually happening. That's actually preserved.
Well, this brings up a question. All right, those in power who remain behind, I mean, in what regard would they have been held? I mean,
well, we have some examples of that, like Frederick II, for example. Frederick II vowed to go on crusade much earlier than he actually went, and for a long time he was chided by the Pope. He was actually supposed to be involved in the Fifth Crusade. He was supposed to be there, leading the whole thing. Actually,
but I'm thinking more in terms of the ordinary, the rank and file noblemen. I mean, the guys who had lands to defend. They had their own business to take care of at home, and they couldn't go.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. That'd probably be a harder question to answer because we don't have as much information.
Were they held in disregard, or were they held in? I mean, they were performing an important function. I mean, they keeping the homeland safe.
Yeah, Scott, real quick, can I repeat your question?
Sure.
I missed part of it.
Oh, well, it's just about those who chose not to go, who are qualified to go but had other things to do. They had a principal or a county or a bear. They had other responsibilities. They had to keep their people safe. They had to fight local war.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
there wasn't any.
What type of regard were they held in? I mean, at that time, I'm just thinking about the time of the First Crusade. I mean, when everything, there was just this huge, overwhelming enthusiasm. The men who stayed behind with good purpose, were they regarded?
I mean, I would definitely say there was no such thing. Yeah, there was no such thing in 11th century Europe as the white feather movement or anything like that. There weren't women handing out white feathers, to guys who didn't go like their counterparts would in 1914, for the Great War. I think it was more sort of a, hey, okay, yeah, you're doing what's normally done, but Crusaders were just held in much higher regard, you went and did something special. You went and did something that was above and beyond. You went and did something that was, truly noble. But I don't think there was any particular, like shame.
Any stigma or and then of course later on came arrangements for redemption of vows and sponsorship of crusade, of men who are going and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, did you see any of that at the time of the First Crusade, or was it something that involved that would be considered honorable and the right thing to do if you couldn't go? If you had the wealth, you sponsored men to go, or you contributed in some way, but you didn't go yourself. I mean, it's that group that I've been wondered about, interested in.
And that became a huge thing. Yeah, like people you would finance maybe a certain number of nights. You would finance one night.
You had to run your own county, but you could sponsor 10 nights. I mean, it was, what type of merit did that held?
Apparently,
what type of merit did that accrue for the the sponsor?
My understanding
in the idea in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of the population in general. I mean, given the attitudes of the time.
In the eyes of the church, that was held in high regard, absolutely, because the church understood that they needed money for this. You know, there had to be financing for crusade operations. So people who are willing to contribute to it, I mean, it's just like today. People who donate to a cause, they are mentioned at the ceremonies. They are, you know, it takes money to make something move. And so, yeah, people who contributed to crusades financially, the church considered that to be meritorious in a way that, as far as I understand, it was similar to the type of.
Well, it was vow. You know, of course, there's vow redemption where an actual sum could be paid to redeem your vow, and then the money would go to men who are actually the crusade effort itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that didn't really develop until later on, until after crusading became kind of an entrenched, idea or concept, as opposed to something fresh like the First Crusade. Am I correct here, or on the wrong track?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade, there wasn't yet the institution of crusading in place.
Yeah.
It was beginning to develop, right, Ryan?
And
at the First Crusade, it was all very, very new, and this was it was a brand new social phenomenon that streaked across Western Europe like a lightning bolt, and everybody was just kind of like. But I think for a while, everyone was just.
But in terms of the whole eligible population, really very, a small percentage went.
Yes. Well, and that was with all the Crusades. With all the Crusades, you had a very, very small. I mean, probably the most participation you saw was probably with the third. The third is where you actually had three of the most powerful, three heads of the most powerful states of Europe, actually, sign on, and Frederick Barbarossa brought an army, of over 100,000, with him and stuff like that.
Now, is that a real figure? I mean, is that a medieval figure or a real figure?
That's actually the historically accepted.
Really?
Okay.
Figure. Yeah, it was massive.
It's not a publicity figure then. No. So Frederick Barbarossa actually had 100,000 men, or 100,000
around there somewhere.
Wow.
Somewhere in the ballpark of that.
And his untimely death was then a much greater loss than I thought.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that just changed the course of the whole thing. If he had to.
And somebody earlier in the chat asked how Frederick Barbarossa dealt with the Seljuk Turks' harassing tactics. The answer to that is very effectively. Frederick Barbarossa and his army absolutely kicked ass in Anatolia. I mean,
really
pretty remarkable. Yeah, they basically subdued the Byzantine Empire and the Sultanate of Rum. I mean,
the army that he brought was basically the full concentrated might of his entire German and Italian empire. I mean, it was it was basically this juggernaut that just.
And he would be considered the most powerful nobleman in Europe at that time.
Very much so. Very much so.
Or the most powerful monarch, or far beyond. Well, even Richard.
The only thing that stopped Barbarossa was the fact that he had a stroke. I mean, the Seljuks and the Byzantines certainly weren't able to stop him.
What's so interesting, though, is how, everything just fell apart after he died.
Well, that's actually not quite what happened, is my understanding of it.
That's very true, and Stephen's onto a point here.
Apparently what happened was, the army continued on into Antioch itself, but there was a spread of disease that actually wiped out a pretty big chunk of Frederick's army. Yeah, my understanding is that under the Duke of Suabia, who was Frederick's son,
and he was supposed to be highly capable, from what I understand.
Frederick's son, the Duke of Suabia, was a badass, and he he conducted some brilliant military maneuvers against the Saracens in Anatolia. So it's Frederick's Crusade it's an incredible story, and I mean, it was just success after success until one, Frederick's stroke, and two, disease in Antioch. So
then what you're saying is this whole thing about Frederick's armies just dispersing after he died, being, with it being kind of a personality cult rather than an army. I mean, it's really not. We're getting away from the truth there.
Yeah, that's really not what happened.
Okay.
The army remained intact, even after Frederick's death. There was every indication they were going to continue on, but there was just disease actually was always the bigger
that must
problem.
have been huge attrition then. I mean, with an army of 100,000, they must have lost many, many men.
Well,
they had pretty good casualties in Anatolia too, I'm sure.
Yeah. And you got to remember, especially back in that time, and long afterwards. I mean, you had I think you had, what was it, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, Antietam. You had well over 200,000, casualties. The vast majority of those actually weren't from combat. They were from disease. They were from exposure to the elements. So that's something that warfare has always been a perpetual scourge of armies. It's just disease, the elements, things like that. So you have to apply those to a time when they had even less means of preventing them and dealing with them, which would have been back in that time. So it's very easy. It didn't take much for an army to basically dissolve from attrition.
No, but Frederick's son reached and joined Richard's forces with what, maybe 10% of the army of his father's army.
If I remember correctly, it was Frederick's son went back to Europe because they had political reasons for having to get back. It was a few noblemen, a few German nobles who made it, primarily led by Leopold of Austria.
So the Duke of Suavia went back to Europe, but nobles led a remnant of the army. Okay, all right.
Yes. And that's where in Acre you had the political conflict between Richard and Leopold, where Richard's men cast down Leopold's banner on the walls of Acre, because they didn't feel he was worthy of being equal to the kings of England and France, and Leopold never forgot that, and he was super. He kind of left in disgust, after that. And that's when Richard was making his way back to England after the Third Crusade. That's where you get the infamous, Richard's taken prisoner by Leopold and held for ransom and all that kind of thing. So,
Frederick VI, Duke of Suabia, he actually died at Acre in January of 1801. So he was actually dead before Richard or Philip even.
Now, are you speaking of Frederick Barbarossa's son?
Yes. Yeah, the one who was the major badass in Anatolia.
And he was and Frederick Barbarossa's designated successor, I guess.
Right, yeah.
So losing him was a big loss then.
Hey, gents, unfortunately, I'm going to have to call it here.
We're almost done anyway, so
I've got to go run. So, hey, it's been a pleasure. Everyone leaving comments, thanks for your participation. We hope to do this. I think we hope to do this again soon. I think we had a lot of success here.
This is a lot of fun.
But please look us up. Please, if you're new here, look up our groups on Facebook. Look up our SoundCloud channel with all our podcasts and our YouTube channel, of course. But other than that, hey, Stephen, thanks for having me here. Scott, same thing.
Okay, Rand. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, you all take care, and Deus Volt.
Deus Volt, Rand.
All right.
Rand is always a huge contributor to anything we do. So it's always great to have his knowledge. So absolutely. So okay, so it's just you and me, Scott.
Well, shall we take a couple more questions, Stephen?
Yeah, I think let's see.
I'm not getting questions. Whenever I switch over to YouTube, everything gets garbled. Apparently, so I'll just let you. You go ahead and pick a question. I'm not getting them on my feed at all. When I switch to YouTube, the sound gets messed up. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing some questions here in the chat. Let's see here. Somebody goes, "What's a good book to read to my niece and children about the Crusades as a story?" Wow. It depends on how old they are. I would guess probably Thomas Madden's A New Concise History of the Crusades.
Yeah.
And then somebody goes, "I have one where the peasants as dumb as is commonly claimed." I'm going to say no.
That just ties into the whole myth of the cannon fodder and guys with pitchforks and armed with sticks and pitchforks and dragged off the fields and
and if you
kind of thing.
If you were transported back,
fanatics, who followed Peter the Hermit, that just ties into that whole kind of negative idea of the total relationship between the nobility and the peasantry, in feudal Europe.
Yeah, I think that if you were transported back in time to medieval Europe, the peasants would know all kinds of stuff that you didn't, and you would be relying on them to survive.
That's what I mean. It was a mutual thing. I mean, they had to live.
Yeah.
They depended upon each other. The nobility and the peasantry. They formed their own functions. There had to be a level of mutual respect and that kind of thing. I mean, there was where they held each other in a higher regard than is depicted in all the trash we see from Hollywood and popular novels and that kind of thing, where there's this whole stereotype of the downtrodden peasantry who starved and were dragged. The women were regularly raped, and the Lord took the women on the first night, and they were dragged out off the fields, to fight. And I mean, that to me, that's just a complete myth.
Yeah, and then somebody goes, "What's the worst thing about Kingdom of Heaven?"
Well, where do you start?
Impossible to start. Everybody is depicted wrong. Saladin is depicted totally wrong. Saladin is depicted as some sort of peace-loving hippie, where in reality, Saladin was a committed warlord. He was committed to the personal power of his own dynasty above all else. He was committed to Ayyubid domination over the entire Sunni world as in his immediate region. Balian of Ibelin is totally depicted wrong. In fact, I probably shouldn't launch into a rant about Kingdom of Heaven, because
I'll say this. When I first saw Kingdom of Heaven in 2005 in first release, and they got around to the part about they were hanging Templars for killing Muslims, and
okay, that may be the dumbest part of the movie.
And then that and there was one other thing that just struck me as of course they depicted Guy de Lusignan and all of them as Templars, and these were monastic men. I mean, they weren't. They were the members of a monastic order. They weren't married.
Yeah, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem would have rewarded Templars for for just capturing a Muslim convoy or something like that. I mean, that's crazy, but it's okay, because Real Crusades history is here now, and we are going to set the record straight. And there's going to come a time when we're going to have our own big budget film project. So,
yes,
Real Crusades history we are going all the way, and just increasing in our reach all the time. And, we feel great, don't we, Scott?
Absolutely. I mean, in the time I've been with you, Stephen, we've seen Real Crusades history grow just literally exponentially.
Oh yeah, it's been amazing, and
and this is in the last 4 years.
Yeah, and
I've been with you for over 3 years now, 3.5 years.
Yeah, I feel like we've worked hard, and everybody's put a lot of effort into it, and it's great.
Yeah, it's just grown tremendously in that time. And
we're gonna keep going.
I mean, I've just all these new people, great new people come on board, and I mean it's just become a tremendous enterprise. But you started it all.
Yeah, and we're going to keep going. So, but anyway, that pretty much is the end. It's 9 o'clock now. So, Scott, I'm going to say it's time for us to wrap this up. What do you think?
I think it's fine.
All right.
Yes, 9 o'clock. We've been on an hour and a half, and I think we've covered a lot of things.
Absolutely. Well,
all right,
everybody who's been here, thanks so much. Thanks so much for the questions. We appreciate it. It's been great. Go to realcrusadeshistory.com, and this has been a lot of fun, and I know we're going to do this again soon. So
I think this was a success.
Yeah, we'll do it again. And some people are asking, when are you going to do this again? We will let you guys know. We'll let you know on the Facebook group. Look us up on Facebook. You can find us on. I'm on Twitter, J. Stephen Roberts on Twitter, and just here on the YouTube channel, I'll definitely announce it. But yeah, and don't forget to check out my book, Why Does the Heathen Rage, and Scott's book, To Shine with Honor. So,
thank you, Stephen. They're both good books.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Deus Vult to everybody, and this has been a lot of fun. We'll talk to everybody soon.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Good night, Stephen.
Good night. Night, Scott.